In this session, we will be looking at non-Christian religions in the United States. Although this class is called History of American Christianity, of course, I think there's some important things that we can learn about American culture and its influence on Christianity by seeing how some of these other religions have adapted and modified to existence in the United States as well. I think as well as we move into talking about contemporary trends in the United States, it's important to have some of this background because there are some things taking place in the United States when it comes to Christianity that reflect the presence of non-Christian religions. Now, there have been non-Christians in the United States since some of the very earliest times, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I don't want to make it sound like it's only been within the past couple decades that we have started to see non-Christian religions. Now, yes, there are certain religions that have become more prominent, whose adherents have become more numerous in recent decades due to immigration. But that doesn't mean that they are just now, within the past couple decades, coming to the United States. That in fact, there have been adherents from some of these religions reaching far back into the very earliest days. Before there even was a United States. I'm going to be looking at basically four religions: Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. There are certainly more than just those four non-Christian religions in the United States. There are certainly representatives of other non-Christian religions that are that started in other countries, and there are certainly some homegrown religions that started in the United States that are unique to the United States, that in some cases have spread to other places. But I want to focus on these four, not to exclude the others or to say necessarily these four are more important to some extent for our understanding of American Christianity. But I do think, of course, that especially with Judaism and Islam, the historical connections between those three Western religions, do kind of reflect, that a unity, a similarity, a common background. Let's start with talking about Judaism. Today, about half of the world's Jews live in the United States. About half live in Israel, and then there are again, it's not exactly half and half, but about half in each place, and then the rest are scattered in a couple other locations in Europe and a few other places. So a lot of Jews live in the United States and have lived in the United States. In fact, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, with some of these religions, they have been there from a very long time. For example, one of the first incidences that we know of is a man named Joachim Gauss, who was part of the Roanoke Island community. Right? This is the lost colony that disappears mysteriously, that we really don't know what happened to them. So even before Jamestown existed, even before Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony, before those were in existence, there were Jews. There was a Jew present in what would become the United States. Probably the first largest, or first substantial representation of Jews is 1654. There is a group from Holland and from Germany that come to New Amsterdam, which is today New York, but at the time was under Dutch control. And so they come to trade. And then there's also a group of Jews from Brazil who come to the colonies as well around the same time. Now, those refugees are coming from originally from Spain. They had gone from Spain to Brazil and will eventually make their way to the colonies. This group of Jews are often called Sephardim or Sephardic Jews. The term has its roots in the biblical text. There's a text in the Old Testament that talks about Sephard, and some people believed that meant Spain, and so that's why the connection, right? These Sephardic Jews. Now they had left Spain, fleeing the Inquisition. The Inquisition was ecclesiastical court within Catholicism that was predominantly focused at its creation on eliminating heresies in the Catholic Church. But at various times, the Inquisition was turned to those outside of Catholicism. And so in the 15th century, 16th century, there were efforts by the Inquisition to convert Jews and Muslims in Spain. Of course, the heavy Muslim population, because of the expansion of Islam, which had gone into Spain kind of in the 8th century, was kind of stopped in Spain, but there was still a significant presence of Muslims and Jews as well. And so the Inquisition was turned to basically force Jews and Muslims to convert. And if they didn't convert, they were to be expelled. So you have some Jews and Muslims that at the very least appeared to convert. You know, one of the challenges we have, looking back historically, is answering the question of, did they truly convert? Right? If we think of conversion as something that has an internal component, where you're not just outwardly obeying and following the rituals and the practices, that you're not just outwardly saying the things that you believe, we also believe that there's kind of this internal component of actually believing those things, actually experiencing those things. Well, that component is difficult to read back into the historical record because we frequently don't have any sort of account. So unless we find a diary and the person really opens up to the diary, right? I mean, if you think, for example, that your diary is going to possibly be read, you may not be completely honest even in your diary. So there's a lot of historical difficulty in thinking about, were there Jews, were there Muslims that truly converted to Christianity or to Catholicism? And then, of course, the level of coercion that's present here as well. So there were individuals that apparently converted, and then there were others that did not convert, that were forced, that did not even outwardly convert, that were forced to leave. And so this group of Jews that we're talking about that will eventually come to the colonies in the 17th century was one of those groups of Jews. They leave Spain, they go to Brazil, eventually move from Brazil to the colonies. Now, when it comes to Judaism in the colonies, there are a couple of things that take place. There were efforts by Jews to assimilate to the Christians around them. They adopted various modes of dress, other types of behaviors that would have lessened any sort of distinguishing markings between themselves and their Christian neighbors. A lot of the practice of Judaism was private. There were some synagogues that were developed, and so that would be more public types of worship, but predominantly a lot of Jews practiced privately because there were often laws or at least strong habits in various places that prohibited Jewish religion, Jewish religious practices, pretty much like what we saw with Catholicism. So Catholics and Jews often found, that they were experiencing the same things because they didn't line up with Protestant Christianity. Now, some of that is lessened around the beginning of the 18th century, so the 1700s. And so you start to see a couple synagogues being built. You see a little bit more of Jews in public life. But there is quite a bit of anti-Semitism towards Jews that has been a part of Christianity since almost the beginning, and some Jews perhaps would argue that there was, even from the beginnings of Christianity, an anti-Semitism. And that's, one of the things that Christians, I think, need to explore is certainly within Christianity, even from Paul, who was a Jew, there are some things he writes against Jews because of the developments with Jesus being the Messiah and what that means and how Israel fits into God's plan, etc. So he does write some things against Jews. He writes some things against followers of Jesus who overemphasized certain elements of Judaism that they wanted particularly Gentiles to practice. So we have these Judaizing teachers that Paul is frequently opposed because of some of the things they are trying to bind on the Gentiles. Is that anti-Semitic? All right, that's not to the level of what we'll see in the 3rd and 4th century, particularly the 4th century, when Jews are beaten for their involvement in the death of Jesus. All right, so even from the earliest times, there are some examples of kind of anti-Judaic responses, perhaps more towards a certain version of Judaism rather than the law, the prophets themselves. But that eventually becomes an anti-Semitism that for throughout Europe, plagues, bad occurrences were often blamed on the Jews. All right, and Jews were forced to live in certain areas, right? These ghettos that were developed to force Jews into living in these specific places. So what starts as kind of an anti-Judaism eventually becomes an anti-Semitism that then has a very long history in Christianity, both Catholic Christianity and Protestant Christianity. And so it's only gradually that Jews are able to begin to worship more freely. In many respects, they tend to get some of those rights prior to Catholics getting some of those rights, predominantly because there is a greater fear of Catholicism among the Protestant colonists There aren't as many Jews in um, the colonies, and so there isn't as much of a fear of some of the things that they could do. But there's always a greater fear of Catholicism. However, as more freedoms occur throughout the 1700s, and as the revolution takes place, and there's a lot more freedom, there is a great transformation that takes place. Again, somewhat parallel to what we see with Catholicism. Freedom of religion meant a lot of things to Catholics, of course, and we see something similar with Judaism, although certainly to a greater extent, because there isn't a centralized hierarchy like there was with Catholicism. And so Jews faced similar types of questions about how they were to be Jews in a situation where they had greater freedoms than Jews had had in Europe in the past, that they had eventually had a greater voice in not just in their religion, but in the country around them. And so how does Judaism, which until this point had, well, until this kind of time period, this 18th, 19th century, had largely been a group that looked back, that had a strong traditional component to it, that relied on not just the biblical text, but an oral tradition helping to understand that biblical text, that shaped so much of not just your identity, right? What you did and what you did in worship, but shaped things like what you ate, how you dressed, a variety of other types of cultural stuff. And so in Europe and in the United States, Jews began to develop into a couple of different groups based on some people wanting to hold on to traditional values, traditional practices, and others looking for opportunities to bring freedom to Judaism. And so that clash, that tension between meeting the present and the freedoms that it offered, while also connecting with the past, led to some changes as various people decided, well, this is how we do that. This is how we hold on to the past, connect to the past, yet also meet the present. There were some demographic changes as well. From 1776, so right after the revolution, right at the revolution, to 1840, almost 3 out of 10 marriages involving Jews were intermarriages. So it was Jews marrying non-Jewish partners. Now, frequently, it would have been more often Jewish women marrying non-Jewish men. A tradition had developed, because intermarriage, this is not, again, not something entirely new, But it does represent that there's a shift taking place in Judaism, a demographic shift. So there's the question of freedom and tradition and that tension. There is the demographic change that's taking place of these intermarriages. And in many cases, Jews intermarried without converting. So they maintained their Jewish identity. Now, more often, as I mentioned, it would be Jewish women marrying non-Jewish or Gentile men, predominantly, of course, Christians. That was a little bit more acceptable in Jewish minds because to identify as a Jew, the practice was that you needed to have a Jewish mother. Now, if you had a Jewish mother, you were Jewish. Now, eventually, some Jewish communities shift that, and so it's, if you have one Jewish parent. But for a while, it was, if your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. So, a Jewish man would be heavily discouraged from marrying a non-Jewish woman, although, it certainly happened too. But, it would be a little bit more acceptable if a Jewish woman married a non-Jewish man, because there would still be that lineage. There were other changes related to women that were important as well. One was increased seating in the synagogues for women. In many cases, up until this point, it was predominantly men that were involved in Judaism, and the sexes were kept separate. There had been a section for men, a section for women, but the section for women was very small, and that had to do with some ideas about educating women and the role of men and etc. So that begins to change. There's more mixed choirs. Instead of the choirs just being men, there's women involved in these choirs, and there is an increased visibility in the synagogue of women. Previously, they'd kind of been, behind screens, some things like that, and some of those changes allow women to be more present, visibly present in the synagogue. There are other changes that take place throughout the 19th century to the Jewish community that are important for thinking about the presence of Jews in the United States. One is this large influx of Jewish immigrants. In some respects, there is a parallel here, again, between Jews and Catholics, in that the Jewish population in the United States explodes in size throughout the 19th century. Now, nowhere near the numbers of Catholics that are coming, that are immigrating, but still a sizable transformation that is taking place. So between 1820 and 1840, the population of Jews in the United States increases from roughly 3,000 to about 15,000, so a five-fold increase. Between 1840 and 1860, about 150,000 Jews immigrate. So that by 1877, the population is about 250, so about 250,000 people in 1877, which is kind of when we have some firmer numbers. Now, this later influx, coming toward the end of the 19th century and then even into the beginnings of the 20th century, are of a different group of Jews. Right? So that first group of Jews, eventually it's the Sephardic Jews that are coming from more Western Europe. These later Jews that are immigrating are what are known as Ashkenazic Jews. that are coming more from Eastern Europe. And so that they have different views of Judaism, have a different set of Jewish practices. And so there's some tensions there because of just some of the different cultural aspects of Jews. As Jews came to the United States, they spread to various places, but not evenly. For example, in 1860, a quarter of Jews that came to the United States stayed in New York City. New York City, of course, was one of the places where a lot of immigrants came through with Ellis Island. But a lot of Jews did leave to go to other places, but a sizable group stayed in New York City and stayed in some of those big, and even in other places it was predominantly staying in the big cities. Now that meant that there were some challenges for Jews. In order to have a synagogue and to have worship services, the tradition was there was a need for a minyan. The minyan required 10 men. So you needed to have 10 men to constitute a synagogue, which meant as well that you needed 10 men to be present for services to take place. So, if you didn't have 10 men, you couldn't have a synagogue. So, as they're dispersing unevenly, some places were able to have services, synagogues. Other places were not, because of those challenges and not having the number of people that they needed to have. So what was it that led to kind of these Jewish communities actually becoming, full-fledged Jewish communities, with not just being ethnically Jewish there, but having, a vibrant practice of Judaism? Well, there were a couple of things that needed to take place. First, of course, was the need for 10 men to constitute the minyan. But there also needed to be, people that were actually interested in practicing their religion. All right? I mean, that's if you exist in a community for a while and they're, religious community, and there isn't the desire to practice your religion, right? So here you are, you're geographically dispersed. You don't have enough men to constitute the minyan, to create a synagogue, to have services, which you believe is very important. You can do some stuff at home, certainly, but eventually it gets to the point where there's enough men in a specific area. You may have been doing fine at home. Right? There needs to be this renewed desire for community if for so long you're, practicing who you are, practicing your identity, practicing your religion, without a visible community. Now, oftentimes that also required a leader to kind of step forward and say, I'm going to be responsible for, holding this community together. So you need to have enough people. You needed to have this desire to be religious together. You needed to have somebody who would serve as the leader, and frequently there was the necessity of having support from another community, another synagogue that was already pretty well established, that could provide some of the benefits, some financial support to get a synagogue built, some financial support to get a Torah scroll, or some of the other components that are useful in worship, right? So, a lot of these places needed to make those connections to these already established synagogues and communities in order to get enough momentum going to, kind of get something started, to get a local synagogue, to get the people committed to worship, committed to gathering, etc. So, just because Jews were present in these places, it didn't always lead to visible religiosity until some of these other things took place. Enough men, desire for religious practice, somebody to kind of take the focus and the leadership, and making those connections with those well-established the communities. And so when it came to how Jews thought in the United States about their survival as a community, and Jews surviving and not just assimilating into the American culture around them, right? How do Jews survive when there are such small numbers? And so there's all these pressures to assimilate. There are these challenges to having a vibrant worship religious community. So how do Jews survive in this? Well, there were various people that had various ideas about that, that were often went in different directions. There were three basic ideas that historians point to that were strategies for survival. One was a more traditionalist route, believing that there was a necessity to have continual Jewish education, connect people to their traditions, connect people to the biblical text, and educate them in the religion and the traditions of the religion, and that would allow the community to survive. Others believed, no, what's necessary is a reformation of Jewish religions. We need to modernize Jewish religion, update it, make it something that is more contemporary. And then some were less concerned about religion and more about community, right? That instead of focusing on the religion, let's create more secular models that will help us maintain a Jewish identity, but there's not as much of a concern about religion. I'm only really going to focus on one aspect of that, the more Reformation aspect, and talk about how Reform Judaism really was an attempt to address one of those survival aspects by modernizing. And so Reform Judaism is the largest type of Judaism that exists in the United States today. It's about kind of a 40-20-20 split, with the other 20 kind of not so much about religion. So about 40% are Reform Jews, 20% Orthodox, 20% conservative, and then the others kind of a mixture of atheists and maybe even some ultra-Orthodox, some that are still religious but not quite, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But Reform is probably the biggest group. And Reform Judaism starts in Europe in the 19th century. Has some antecedents in the Enlightenment, as people begin to think about reason and revelation and religion. In Christianity, same things are happening with Judaism, and so you have this kind of desire to develop a Judaism that is more connected with reason, that is more modernized, and Reform Judaism comes out of that. Well, with the tension that develops between wanting a more modernized religion and wanting to hold on to the traditional aspects of religion, right, which is the main tension between Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. You have this Reform Judaism that attempts to kind of develop who it is and what it means to be a Reform Jew. And so toward the end of the 19th century, a group of Reform Jews gather in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and they develop a document that essentially lays out, this is what Reform Judaism is. And so it's referred to as the Pittsburgh Platform. Developed in the 1880s to kind of identify what Judaism is. Now, one of the first things they note is that Judaism is the highest conception of the God idea. And, on the, the kind of surface of that, we might say, well, what does that mean? Well, there's a couple of things that are going on here. One is it does open the possibility for other competing conceptions, particularly Christianity and Islam. And there'll be some comments in one of the other elements of the platform that specifically addresses those religions. But what's also going on here is an openness to God not necessarily being a personal being. Now, some of that is gradually walked back in Reform Judaism. But one of the things that does appear to be present in Reform Judaism is less about God being an idea, a person, as it is about an idea. Now, we'll talk about a form of Judaism that goes even further than that, Reconstructionist Judaism. But for right now, you have this modification, this openness to other religions, this openness to God not being necessarily a personal God. Another component of the platform was the claim that modern scientific research was not antagonistic to Judaism. At the base, this is Judaism's reckoning with Darwinism. Okay. How does Judaism and its particularly biblical text line up with these scientific discoveries? And so just as Christianity had a reckoning with Darwin, and even still today still has a reckoning with Darwin, Judaism did as well. Well, Reformed Jews were open, much like liberal Protestants were, to reconceptualizing their understanding of the biblical text in light of scientific claims. So ultimately, the idea being here that Judaism could be reformed based on scientific research, that perhaps new scientific information provided us greater insight into how the world worked, and so we needed to modify our understandings of the biblical text. Again, very similar to what's taking place in Christianity, in that some are becoming open to evolution and some of the other things that are connected with Darwinism, other Jews and Christians being more opposed to that. A third component was the idea that ceremonies should elevate and sanctify lives. Now, on the surface, we might say, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good position, but what it largely meant was an attack on Orthodox Jews that wanted to hold on to a variety of traditions and practices that they believed were a part of the law, whether written or oral. And so, they were holding on to it. For Reformed Jews, it was believed that they were holding on to it for tradition's sake. It wasn't Some of these things they weren't necessarily grounded in Jewish identity or the biblical text. And so essentially here, there is the understanding of that as a Jew, or as a Jewish community, a Reformed Jewish community, if we found elements within Judaism that did not provide benefit in the contemporary society, those things could be eliminated. They didn't need to be held onto simply because they were tradition. So if they didn't elevate or sanctify lives, they could be abandoned. And so things like dress, food laws, gender roles, all of those could be reinterpreted in light of modern society, and there wasn't a need to hold on to those things just because they had been practiced for a long time. Another component was the approach of the Messianic age. Notice it's a Messianic age, not a Messiah. Many Orthodox communities at that time, and some still today, were looking for a specific person to come and be a leader for the Jews. Reformed Jews essentially dropped that and looked more towards a Messianic age, that there would come an age, a time period, when some of the benefits of peace and harmony would be present in the world. So less about a person, more about a period of time. In the wake of Zionist movements that were pushing for a return to Israel, to a Jewish homeland, Reformed Jews said, no, Judaism is about being a religious community, not being a specific nation. Now, it's the 1880s when Reformed Jews create the Pittsburgh Platform. At that point, they did not expect that within 70 years, less than 70 years, there would be a new Jewish homeland, right, in 1948. So, they did not believe there should be a push for a Jewish homeland. Now, once there was a nation of Israel, Reformed Jews became much more supportive of people who wanted to return and live in Israel, and have been very supportive of Israel. So they kind of stepped back from this once there actually was a nation of Israel. But in the 1880s, they didn't believe there was going to be a restored nation. So, encouraging people to just move on. Right? That it's not going to happen. Let's just focus on being who we are, where we are. There was also an emphasis on Judaism being a progressive religion, that it could change, it could modify, modernize as necessary. And then finally, they did note that there was a connection between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Again, though there have been some difficult relationships between those three religions, adherents of those three religions. And so this was kind of more of an openness to recognizing those connections than perhaps were open within Orthodox Judaism. As we get into the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, there are other forms of Judaism that develop. One of those is known as conservative Judaism. It arises within Orthodox Judaism, right? So through the 18th, 19th century, you have these two basic groups: Reformed Judaism, attempting to modernize, Orthodox Judaism, holding on to tradition, holding on to practices that they believe date back to the time of Moses or to the time of the rabbis, etc. Well, the modern pressures that lead to the formation of Reform Judaism, to its split from Orthodoxy, kind of stay there in Orthodox Judaism. So conservative Judaism develops within Orthodox Judaism. It's not some Reform Jews who went off and said, no, we've gone too far, let's pull back. No, conservative Jews arise out of Orthodoxy. So you have these European rabbis coming, these Ashkenazic rabbis, who are very exclusively minded. They're very anti-modern. They have some of these, they're really pushing some things that there are some that say, no, we don't want to go that far back. Right? And so conservative Judaism will eventually kind of split off from Orthodox Judaism, feeling some of the same tensions that had led to the Orthodox Reform split. And so conservative Jews kind of take this bifurcated strategy. They want to hold on to some elements, but they're also open to adaptation. Right? So there's some openness to conserving some practices while also adapting others. And so, usually, we'll talk about that here in a second. So, for conservative Jews, there was an openness to secular culture. Not a complete openness, right? But there's more openness there than what had been present in Orthodoxy. And then there's also some issues regarding women that are pushing this split as well. One of those is the question of the anchored wife. So, in Judaism, a woman could not pursue a divorce. If she was abandoned, that was one thing. If her husband died, that was another thing. So, for example, in World War I, you have these men who go off to war, and then they just don't come back. And there isn't a clear, this person died in action, right? This person was killed, was a casualty of war. And so you have these women who, because of Jewish tradition, couldn't get remarried because they don't know for sure if their husband's dead. Their husband just may have decided, you know what, I like it in Europe, I'm not going back. Never divorces their wife, never lets their wife know. And so here you have this woman who is anchored to a husband who may be dead, who may be living with another woman someplace. And yet she is stuck in a situation where, of course, we're talking early 20th century, so women still needed frequently men for financial survival, if they wanted to have a family, certainly, and then, of course, in a very heavily family-oriented religion like Judaism, there was a high pressure to get married and to have families. But here you have this wife who does not know, right, that, okay, if I somehow convince, people to let me get married, my husband might come back, right? So conservative Jews kind of develop, this is one of the issues that Jews kind of begin to debate over, and conservative Jews are become open to, helping out these women that are caught in this situation of, I don't know if my husband is dead or not. Another issue, of course, was mixed seeding, and the wanting families to sit together. Reform Judaism open to that. Orthodox Judaism very much, separate the men and the women, and so conservatives, you want to have both. Historical precedent becomes the key for Jews making this decision as far as what they adapt, what they hold on to. So if it has a long history, if it's grounded in the biblical text, it's kept. So the order of worship. Conservative Jews believed that the order of worship went back to the times of the temple. So you keep that. Keep the use of Hebrew in prayer services and in the synagogue service. Certain dress styles went back to the late Middle Ages. There's no need to keep that, right? So there's these differences that take place that allow Jews to make some changes, they believe, acceptably, while holding on to some things where Orthodox Jews would have been very opposed to such a position. There is a lot more we could say about Judaism. We haven't even touched, of course, issues of the Holocaust and how that had a profound effect on Judaism and led to some changes in Judaism and some of those things. So, but in the sake of time, we need to kind of move on. So we'll leave Judaism and move on to talking about Islam in the United States. It's really difficult to get a good sense of how many Muslims there are in the United States. And with these religions, I would also like to say I'm not going to really spend much time talking about some of their beliefs and practices, which I think are important, but we're predominantly focusing on their presence in the United States. I would encourage you, if you're interested, you can look further in my YouTube channel for other videos about the religious background, the historical background, some of the beliefs and practices of these groups. But let's talk about Muslims. And we're not really sure how many Muslims there are in the United States. There are a wide variety of numbers. What we can say is there have been roughly the breakup has roughly been about 40% come from India, about 40% are African American in heritage, and then about 20% hail from other places, including Arab countries. Most of the Arabs in the United States, however, are probably from the Christian places in the Middle East. Right? So most of the Arabs have kind of more of a Christian background and have escaped persecution by coming to the United States. So not all people of Arab descent in the United States are Muslim. Now, usually you'll see numbers ranging from 2 million to 12 million, with usually like 6 to 8 million being kind of the common estimate. So for example, though, there was a Pew study done just a few years ago that said there were about a little over 3.5 million Muslims in the United States. So why do we get such varying numbers? Well, we get these varying numbers because religious information is not a part of the census. Right? So you don't have kind of a good governmental program gathering religious information. And it would seem likely, maybe less so today, but certainly over the past couple decades, less openness to identifying as Muslim in the United States because of 9/11. So, that has prevented some good information. So that makes it problematic. When did Muslims come to the United States? Well, it's unclear. Some scholars have suggested that there were African Muslims who landed in the American continents prior to the arrival of Columbus. And they claim to have some evidence for that. That's not a widespread belief, but there are some that do make that claim. There's some scholars that suggest there were Muslims on Columbus's crew, which is possible. There were Muslims in Spain at the time. There are some artifacts, some inscriptions that these historians will point to suggest the presence of Muslims, and make claims based. They have evidence. They're not just kind of speaking out of the top of their head. Claims that they intermarried with Native Americans, set up trade. But it's not convinced all scholars. So it's kind of more of a hypothetical belief. There is more evidence that some Muslims immigrated to the Caribbean because of the policies in Spain. We talked about the Jewish exile, so there's some evidence that Muslims left Spain as part of the Inquisition. So that's a possibility as well. But the one clear evidence that we have is African slaves. That there were African slaves in the early colonial period into the United States. Now, we'll say more about that in a little bit, because what I want to focus on is kind of global Islam, right, international immigration, and then we'll talk about African American Islam. And so we'll come back to this issue about African slaves in a little bit. So let's focus on those that are not of African or African American, that are not made up of Africans or African Americans. There were several waves of immigration of Muslims throughout the 19th century and on, right? So more of the global presence of Islam has been more late 19th century. The first wave of global Muslims came from places like Lebanon, Syria, as well as other Middle Eastern countries. These were areas under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and so these were predominantly single young men coming to the United States. Some of them didn't want to serve in the Turkish army. Others looking to make wealth and then return. Often they faced challenges. English, being Muslim in a non-Muslim land, ended up working as cheap labor. Not many of them actually went back. Instead, many of their relatives came to join them around the time of World War I. So the relatives of the first wave, there are people coming to escape the destruction of World War I, wanting to leave countries that now had colonial European powers. So as the Ottoman Empire, which was on the side of the Germans in World War I, that gets carved up by France and Britain, and so many of these countries are started in the post-war period, and so they have these European powers over these previously Muslim ruled areas, and so some people are leaving that. Now, there were immigration laws passed in the 1920s and essentially ended that second wave, brought it almost to a halt. So the third wave, which is 1920s and 1930s, is much more limited because there are quotas based on their country of origin. Many who did tended to be relatives of people that were already there. And so it's not much immigration that takes place during this period. And it's not until post-World War II that you see a rise again in Muslim immigration. It's still limited because of the quotas that are in place, the immigrant quotas. But you have people coming from India. Pakistan is a new country at this point. And so you see some people coming from that. Muslims coming from Europe, the Soviet Union. Many of those Muslims that are coming were very highly educated, and they're already kind of westernized to some point. And in many cases, it was a lot easier to integrate into American society. There were also people that came, wanting to increase their education, increase technical training, and so that's that fourth wave. The fifth wave, in 1965, Congress created an immigration act that got rid of those quotas. And so immigration was more about individuals rather than their country of origin, where they grew up. And so immigration from Europe declined, and immigration from the Middle East and Asia increased. And about half of that immigration was Muslim. Often it was the political turmoil, political violence that has been a reason that many of these Muslims immigrate. And they came to a variety of places. The oldest continuous Muslim community, for example, is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And so the Midwest is a place that they went to. And then of course, once there's a sizable community there, more people are drawn to that. New York, of course, has been a large spot for people to stay as immigrants. Chicago, there were large populations. California, Dearborn, Michigan, so is another place. There's some very early mosques. When Ford moved its plant to Dearborn in the 1920s, many Arabs immigrated there. Shipbuilding brought people to New England, right? So there's all sorts of places that Muslims have gone in the United States, and that has led to kind of a dispersion. There are some challenges that Muslims face in the United States that I think are important to note. One of those has to do with the saying of prayers. Muslims are encouraged and expected, if they are devout, to say prayer 5 times a day. There are some modifications depending on what type of Muslim one is, but in general, 5 times a day. Well, most employers aren't particularly open to, having people stop what they're doing a couple times. Not all of those prayer times are during work hours, but some of them are, and so wanting someone to allow you to stop what you're doing, say your prayers. So the employer time, and then also, of course, the way Muslims say these prayers makes it quite obvious that they are Muslim. It's not kind of an internal experience where I'm just sitting and I could have my eyes open or my head bowed, and you might think I'm praying, or you might think I'm just kind of resting my eyes or napping. But if you're a Muslim saying your prayers, these particular prayers, it involves bowing, kneeling, prostration. You are very visibly Muslim when you're saying prayers, and so that is a challenge, especially after 9/11. Ritual slaughter, right? Just like Jews, there are some dietary restrictions that the devout Muslims practice. One of those dietary guidelines. One of those has to do with how meat is killed. And so food has to be prepared in certain ways. Now, up until recently, within the past couple decades, Muslims kind of had to buy kosher food from Jewish suppliers because it would be along the lines of what they would expect for ritual slaughter. There have been more places where food is ritually slaughtered, but a lot of that is more, some of these centers, these big places, these big population centers. There are other dietary restrictions that devout Muslims follow, prohibitions against pork and alcohol. And we might think, okay, well, it should be pretty easy to avoid that. But pig products are not just meat. Lard, other types of shortening sometimes come from animals like pigs. What are all the ingredients in this particular food, using pork as a filler for other types of meats. So a Muslim that wants to follow these prohibitions has to be mindful of, in a restaurant, what type of grease or oil was this prepared in? What type of ingredients are in this thing? Right? What kind of oil was used to make them, etc. Gender roles are challenges, especially in the United States. What does that, the traditional roles versus some of the things that women, the men and women in the United States it's different when it comes to gender roles. Dress as well. Of course, certain types of dress distinguish Muslims as Muslims, so that becomes a challenge. Even things like banking and credit and interest become a challenge. There are prohibitions in the Quran against accruing interest. So working at a bank is forbidden. Muslims that want to follow these rules have to avoid mortgages, credit cards, savings. Now, there's certainly banks that will, put your money in a non-interest-bearing account, so you don't get any interest. They're more than willing to get your interest. But there's other things that Muslims need to be mindful of. I want to talk a little bit about African American Islam. As I mentioned already, about 15 to 20% of captured slaves were Muslims. More numerous in the Caribbean and South America, but there were Muslims in North America, Muslim slaves, particularly in the antebellum South. We know this from a couple of things. The names of slaves that were in registers, right? As slaves were bought, they would keep registers of their names, and so they would have Muslim names. There's discussion of slaves that engaged in practices that appear to be Muslim, etc. So we know that there were Muslims that were slaves. But I want to focus predominantly on some developments that are under the umbrella of Islam that kind of combine some elements of African American heritage and Islam. So they're more racial versions of Islam versus the global Islam that we were talking about. And one of those is what's known as the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was founded by a man named W.D. Fard. He was a peddler. He went around selling these things that he claimed were exotic goods from the East, also claiming to teach people about Islam. He claimed that African Americans were members of the ancient tribe of Shabazz, a tribe that was lost but now was being found. So he goes around teaching of this. But eventually he disappears. There's all sorts of theories about why he disappeared, what happened, but there's just not a clear understanding of what took place. And so he disappears, and leadership passes to one of his followers, a man named Elijah Muhammad. He was born Elijah Poole, son of a poor Baptist preacher, eventually hears some of Fard's teaching and begins to follow him. There's claims that he basically, um, ran the nation as a dictatorship, and so there's there's some concerns about that, but he created kind of a hierarchy within the group. When individuals were accepted for membership, they dropped their what was called slave name, their last name, and adopted an X to signify their unknown African heritage. And then eventually, Elijah Muhammad would provide them with a new name at a certain time. There are some similarities between the Nation of Islam and global Islam. Praying 5 times daily, avoiding pork and alcohol, but there are also some big differences, largely because of the teachings of Fard. Some people would eventually claim that Fard was actually God, and so he just kind of appears for a little bit, at a time. He just appeared for a little time. Most Muslims would not accept something like that. The most famous member of the nation, as well as the most famous Muslim in America, is Malcolm X. He was born Malcolm Little, raised in Michigan by a Baptist preacher and his wife, but Malcolm would later claim that he really wasn't that interested in the religion of his childhood. And he saw a lot of prejudice firsthand, including the bombing of his house, the firebombing of his house by the Klan. After a young adulthood of crime in cities of Boston, New York, Malcolm Little was imprisoned for robbery. And in prison, he heard about the Nation of Islam from his family, some of whom were part of it, and he converted. He spent his time reading all sorts of things in prison, and when he got out of prison, he quickly rose through the ranks of the nation. As one of the ministers in the group, he started new temples throughout the country, brought in astounding numbers of converts that were drawn to his message of kind of this self-determination, as well as the theology and the morality of the nation. Throughout the 50s and 60s, he became well known throughout the country for his views, often approached by the press to make some sort of statement on the various issues of the day. Eventually, though, he broke from the nation over a couple of things. One was some sex scandals involving Elijah Muhammad, and that did not live up to the standards, right? And so there are these claims that he had fathered a child out of wedlock. He was involved in a variety of sexual relationships with his secretaries, right? So there's the moral concern. There's some tensions that are taking place between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, because Elijah Muhammad seems to want to have his sons kind of succeed him, but there's a lot of people looking to Malcolm because he's the spokesperson on the forefront. He's very prestigious, and it leads to a split in the early 60s. In 1963, after President Kennedy was assassinated, Elijah Muhammad told all the members of the nation not to comment to the press about it. But the press kept pressing Malcolm for a response. Eventually he said, "The chickens have come home to roost," which essentially is, all these things that we have been doing as a country, we're now seeing the violence return to us. Well, he gets suspended from the nation. During his suspension, he goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca, a very important part of Islam, known as the Hajj. And there he decides to leave the nation and join Sunni Islam. According to his autobiography, which was written with Alex Haley, it's in Mecca that he realizes that whites were not entirely evil, because he met white Muslims on the Hajj, and here you have, on this pilgrimage, you have all these races, people from all over the place. They are, working together for a common goal, right? To make this pilgrimage. They're going on this pilgrimage in harmony. And so, Malcolm, it's not like he fully has this great conversion and now he's embracing whites. There's still a lot that needed to be done, but he did believe, okay, there is a potential here that could be reached of maybe some sort of living equally in the same country. And he also kind of begins to feel some shame, because here he is, supposedly a Muslim, and he doesn't know much about his own religion. Right? He didn't know the ritual for prayer. He doesn't know some of the other basic requirements of Islam. And so, that was something that he was concerned about. Now, after the Hajj, an individual can take a new name. And so he begins to be known as Al-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz. Many in the nation are furious, and even his brother condemns him as a false prophet. But he comes back and he's still, he's speaking on racial issues. He's, developing a couple new organizations apart from the nation, still addressing religious issues. Now, after the split between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, there are several attempts on Malcolm's life. There's a car bomber that is hired to plant a car bomb. Well, he actually ends up telling Malcolm of the plot. A firebomb destroys his house on February 14th, 1965, and he is assassinated a week later during a speech. It's unclear who was involved in his assassination. All three of the members arrested were members of the nation. One of those confessed. The other two maintained their innocence. So there's a question here of who really was behind the assassination of Malcolm X, and it does appear that it was more than just these three individuals from the nation. There was probably a larger conspiracy, and there may have even been some involvement either from the government or local police, or some other things that make this kind of problematic. Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace, will eventually take the leadership of the group, and will actually move it closer to global Islam. Eventually calling it World Community of Al-Islam, and later the American Muslim Mission. The Nation of Islam organization that is led today is led by a man named Louis Farrakhan, the man in the upper right. It's very small in number, and it's kind of a splinter group. The majority of people follow Wallace Muhammad in the late 1970s. And recently he's kind of, also wanted to, kind of become more involved in the global Muslim community, having one community. And in some ways, the nation in recent years has started moving towards the global Muslim presence. We move from Islam to talking about Buddhism in the United States, and some of the things that we see in developments of that religion. The populations of Buddhism as well as Hinduism are not very large in the United States, but they are beginning to grow in various places. just want to briefly talk about Buddhism in the United States. Um, it appears that there are a couple of ways that Buddhism came into the United States. One was through the Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists were people like Thoreau, Emerson, and they became interested in some of these Eastern religions, Buddhism as well as Hinduism. The first English translations of Buddhist scriptures, as well as Hindu scriptures, appeared in the 19th century. Thoreau translated a work called the Lotus Sutra for a magazine called The Dial. They didn't fully adopt these religions. They thought there were some parallels between what they believed as well as what Buddhists believe, but it never really became popular in the United States that way. There were as well some immigrants that came to the United States, bringing their Buddhism with them. Most of them, 1960s is when that took place. But there were some Buddhist immigrants prior to that. Predominantly, there are a couple types of Buddhism that are perhaps more popular than others in the United States, although there are certainly, these aren't the only versions of Buddhism in the United States. One type of Buddhism that was kind of popular, that's been kind of popular in the United States, is known as Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism involves devotion to Amida, the Buddha of infinite light, who, upon his death, claimed that he was going to create a pure land where people could be reborn and attain peace, and that from this peace, or from this place, this pure land, people could be. It would be easier for people to achieve release from the cycle of death and rebirth. Right. So Amida is going to create this land where it makes it easier for people to achieve this freedom. It appears that there's been some success of Pure Land Buddhism because of its similarity to Christianity. It's faith in Amida that will allow you to be reborn into this pure land. It is by Amida's grace that this can take place. Now, the grace is not exactly the same as what we mean with grace when we talk about it in Christianity, but there's some similarity there. The Pure Land in Buddhist thinking is not heaven, but it is enough like heaven that Westerners have found some similarity there. So there's good possibilities that some of the success that Pure Land Buddhism has had is due to those similarities there. Another type of Buddhism that has been popular in the United States is Zen. Now, in Zen, there are a couple of different types of Zen. One of the big things within Buddhism, and as I mentioned, there are other videos on Buddhism on my YouTube channel, and you can explore them more fully. And I talk more about Zen there as well. But within Zen, there are kind of a couple options. Right? The Buddhist is looking for enlightenment, in nirvana. Right? And within Buddhism, there are a varieties of approaches or understandings about how you achieve this enlightenment. And within Zen, there is some differences over the achievement of enlightenment, or what's known as Satori, in Zen Buddhism. That's the enlightenment experience. And it can be a gradual experience, or it could be something that happens very quickly. And so, you sit there, you meditate in the hopes of achieving this experiential wisdom and Zen, experiencing this enlightenment, the Satori. And so there are some schools of Zen that emphasize this sudden enlightenment, but others say no, it's required to have this this experience over time, this meditation over time. Zen Buddhism became popular in the 1950s through a group of American intellectuals known as the Beat Poets. People like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, took some ideas of some Zen Buddhists and kind of popularized them to a larger audience. Ginsberg and Kerouac on the one hand. Another one of those was a man named Alan Watts. Watts, he tried to meld Zen and science, so he's slightly different than what Kerouac and Ginsberg were doing. And it appears that for these people, Ginsberg, Kerouac, and even Watts, they were drawn to Buddhism and Zen Buddhism because of they're dissatisfied with American culture, they're dissatisfied with the imperialism of American culture, they're dissatisfied with how Christianity is being used to kind of baptize that. And so, they're disenchanted with the world, but Zen kind of provides them this alternative spirituality. So they can, critique Western culture, critique American Christianity, and also have kind of this religious component to it as well. Lastly, talk a little bit about Hinduism in the United States. It too is brought over by the Transcendentalists, late 1820s. Emerson is very fascinated with Hindu literature. Thoreau is enamored with a document known as the Bhagavad Gita. Neither of them really understand Hinduism very well. They are not converting to Hinduism by any stretch of the imagination, but they are fascinated by these alternative forms of spirituality. One of the first voices of Hinduism from a Hindu is a man named Swami Vivekananda. In 1893, as part of the World's Fair, there was an event known as the World's Parliament of Religions, and it brought together religious leaders throughout the country, or throughout the world, I should say, to Chicago, as part of this exhibition. And Vivekananda is there as a representative, and in his speech, he kind of calls for this universal religion, said Hinduism was about embracing truths wherever they were to be found, even in different religions. And because he is one of the first Hindu voices to explain Hinduism in the United States, he was very influential in kind of creating this view of what Hinduism was. He will stay in the United States for 2 more years, start a society based off of his views, including writing a book explaining yoga. As I mentioned, he started this Vedanta Society that, presented this notion of there's one God, or God is one, united, but he's just worshipped differently. And so the goal of humanity is to realize their own divinity kind of in connecting God, in connecting to God. And that ultimately, there are these various paths to God that people should follow, right? Very, very ecumenical type of approach. Another type of Hinduism that becomes very popular in the United States is Transcendental Meditation, or sometimes abbreviated TM. It was developed by an individual known as the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who just died it's probably been about 10 years ago. So, we're still talking about pretty recent death. But this goes back to the 60s and 70s is when he started this. He was actually a guru to the Beatles. That's kind of how some of his ideas get popularized. Ultimately, transcendental meditation was described as this simple, natural, effortless, easily learned mental technique practiced for 15 to 20 minutes twice daily, sitting comfortably with the eyes closed. And so the Maharishi taught that our desire to enjoy life is natural, and transcendental meditation, this 15-20 minutes of meditation, was the best path to joy. And that these 20 minutes could bring about transformation. And ultimately, you achieve happiness through this practice by tapping into the divine within you. Right? There's this sense of serenity that you experience, and it was very easy to become a practitioner of TM. You went to an introductory lecture, you get some more advanced information in another lecture, you engaged in a short period of fasting, and then you were given a personal mantra that you chanted during meditation. Now, it started off as this kind of countercultural thing with hippies and with the Beatles, but eventually it started to be incorporated into business clientele. And so there were these businesses that were using TM to help make their executives happier, right? And kind of escape all of the stress of business. It was being used in schools at one point, but ultimately was decided in 1979 by the United States Courts of Appeal, the Court of Appeals, that it was a religion, so it couldn't be taught in schools. Right? So eventually it's out of schools, but it still becomes pretty popular. Another Hindu group practice that becomes prominent is the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, also known as ISKCON, which was focused on devotion to the Hindu god Krishna. And part of it involved these devotional chants, and part of the chant was the name Hare Krishna. So it was Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. And so they were known as Hare Krishnas because they went around chanting this. And it was believed that this chant would bring about liberation and blissfulness. And so, that it's meant to be a transformation. It's a type of Hindu devotionalism called bhakti, where you devote yourself to a specific god. Krishna is actually a avatar of another god known as Vishnu. In addition to the chanting, practitioners were to be celibate, vegetarians, and to live basically a monastic type of lifestyle. And that through this ecstatic dancing and chanting, you could overcome a false consciousness and get a better insight into the world. Certainly there are other types of both Hinduism and Buddhism. There are other non-Christian religions, but I think what we begin to see here in all of these is how each of these religions, and especially with Judaism and Islam, are changing with respect to the United States. You know, they're evolving in a sense in the United States into something different. And if we had more time, we could see the similar types of things in Hinduism and Buddhism, not so much yet from immigrants modifying them, but as Westerners have practiced these religions, right, converted to these religions, they're often westernized forms of it. So, for example, yoga is a important component of Hinduism. But yoga is more of a way or a path. Some of those paths, some of those yogas are about knowledge and insight, wisdom. And then some of them are the more physical things that we connect with yoga, with when we hear the term yoga. But a lot of people, a lot of Westerners have tapped into the physical aspects of yoga. And some may or may not also connect with the spiritual aspects of yoga. Right? So, you know, here too is this, Westerners have taken certain things, just like Westerners took Zen, and are changing how these things were practiced, for example, in India, where they both developed. So there is something about American culture that leads to modification, to change, and that, I think, is important for us to think about then with Christianity. What is it about Christianity in the United States that has changed, that provides, in a sense, blinders for us not to see, right, what the Christianity of the apostolic times was, because we're so shaped by American culture, and how Americanized we have made the gospel. And so those kind of questions, those kinds of things, I think are elements we can draw out of what we see as these non-Christian religions have changed and modified with their presence in the United States. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, and sometimes from the outside, right? It's outsiders that have shaped and made them different. And I think there's some important lessons here for us to learn, even though it's important to understand these religions for themselves. And that's why, again, I keep kind of referring back to the other YouTube videos where I attempt to provide a better, deeper picture into some of these religions on their own, and not necessarily thinking about how Americanized they have become in some ways in that experience.